One. And we are recording with the one and only Dr. Robert Malone. And Tommy, why is your beautiful pale Irish face so red? I definitely didn't just get back from the gym and, you know, Dr. Malone said he's ready now. So when the good doctor says he's ready, I'm ready. So with that, today is Wednesday, October 19th, 2022. And I believe the humane and loving, empathetic researchers in Boston have, for whatever reason, created a COVID strain with an 80% lethality rate. But I am humble enough and I'd like to think mature enough to think that that may or may not be an attention-grabbing headline, and I may or may not grasp the entire thing because I am not a molecular researcher and I don't design molecules with CRISPR. So, Dr. Malone, could you illuminate for me and my fellow audience of plebs to the importance of this and why in God's name are they doing it?
Uh, I can't say why they're doing it. They're chasing a scientific question that has to do with which domains in Omicron versus Wuhan are responsible for the mortality. It's important to remember that the original Wuhan strain in this particular mouse model essentially has a 100% mortality rate. So what they've done is absolutely made a chimeric virus in an effort to try to discern whether it's the modifications in spike itself that are responsible for the shift in mortality associated with Omicron, or is it other domains? And clearly, there are domains outside of spike that are contributing to the morbidity and mortality, the disease and death, in the mutant form versus the, let's say, a precursor hypothetical SARS-CoV-2 that didn't have the furin cleavage site, I guess. What matters about this is that Boston University circumvented the rules. They should not have been doing gain of function research. There's a whole lot of scrambling going on right now about whether or not this was funded in part by NIH, and they had attributed the funding to NIH, but NIH now has disavowed any knowledge of any authorization or even awareness that these studies were ongoing. So then we have Boston University trying to cover its tracks by saying that, well, we only put NIH funding on there as a as a courtesy, and that they didn't actually fund this, and so therefore we didn't actually have to notify them. And what it implies is that Boston University has kind of gone rogue in terms of their oversight process for ensuring compliance with established norms, federally established norms. And they're trying to take the position that, well, we didn't have to follow the federal guidelines and NIH guidelines, even though we performed this in an NIH-funded facility, because the nuance that, well, we didn't specifically rely on NIH for the money for this. We relied on Boston University money. That is splitting hairs. BU received the contract for this BSL-3 high containment facility located in Boston urban area, which I've argued for a long period should never have been done. And it was politically motivated. This is how Tony Fauci plays the game, is he allocates money by congressional districts and basically rewards Congress people with grants and contracts and facilities, etc. There's a whole feedback loop here that's really, it's a more subtle form of the old pork barrel strategy. And because Tony doesn't really work, he doesn't work for the executive branch per se. He can't be fired by the executive branch. His customer is Congress. And he plays a game that's very similar to what biotech plays with Wall Street in the kind of the pump and dump scheme that goes on, and really is florid in the case of the mid-sized vaccine manufacturers. But Tony Fauci's version is kind of very similar, but his customer, his investor, basically is Congress. And so they appropriate money for him. And he has a very large PR group. It's over 60 people that work for him at his branch of NIH. It's not the whole NIH. And they actively cultivate these relationships and provide quid pro quo all the time. And that's basically how Boston University ended up with that facility in Boston as part of the Boston Biomedical Scientific Research Complex. And the logic is obviously flawed. We shouldn't have high containment facilities inside of major dense urban environments. That's just flat out nutso. But BU has managed to capture this. And it could well be that there is a component here, if it is actually funded by Boston University, which is what they're claiming. And that's not just a limited hangout in order to cover everybody's backside. But if that is the case, then I think there does deserve to be scrutiny about why BU would independently fund this kind of work. Often these studies are funded as pilot projects in the hopes of getting a larger contract based on the preliminary data. In this world that we're talking about, the general rule of thumb is that if you want to get a contract to do a block of work or a major grant from NIH, you should have ideally already completed at least half of the research that you were requesting funding for before you submit the proposal. And so universities understand how this game is played because, of course, the way it works is that the deans and the university basically get between a 40% and 100 up to 110% tax on any of the money that's actually awarded for the purpose of doing the research. We call this indirect costs, but that's what it is. All of this is really about generating massive amounts of federal subsidy for the medical schools and their research complexes. Did that make sense, Tommy?
When you say there's a tax, is it the dean and them are skimming it off the top for the university?
Yeah, functionally, that's the case. It's called indirect costs.
Got it.
And so that's a negotiated rate with the federal government. And at places like Harvard, it exceeds 100%. So for every dollar that the investigator gets when he wins his proposal, that the university itself may get $1, $1.10, $1.50. And as it works, that's a separate negotiation that happens between the NIH and the university to establish that indirect cost rate. And the reviewers don't see that. What they see is the cost. The people that are guiding the decisions about what things should be funded and not funded, they're actually told not to consider those issues. They only consider the primary budget. And so that's how that whole thing works. Is in the modern world, most of these investigators are not on a guaranteed salary. They operate as small business people within the university. And in order to have the right to have the status of the university and the infrastructure and use that, they have to basically tithe to their dean and department chair and to the university structure through this kind of system. So they have to raise their own salary, their own costs for doing research, the salaries for all their other people, new equipment, supplies, etc., through obtaining grants. And then when they get that, then they have to have these indirect costs that are taken off the top. And that, the way the ecosystem works is that the universities then take that money that they're getting for indirect costs, quote unquote, and they use some of that as seed capital to fund new projects that will generate new grants.
I mean, we talked last time in the episode we did about, biotech and big pharma kind of being not similar, but rather an offshoot to the DoD and the military industrial complex. And this just solidifies my belief in that, because this sounds almost identical to cost plus contracting or no bid contracting. And also, this is something that like Northrop and Boeing, they were perfecting this system in the 70s
It is.
about congressional, they build factories based
Oh,
on
yeah.
districts of
No, I'm very familiar with the various contracting vehicles, and your metaphor is precisely correct. This is a cost plus fixed fee arrangement.
it's it's almost kind of like it's almost like the speed of light, right? It's like universally accepted as you get closer to that speed, you need exponentially more energy to get the same amount of mass moving forward at an exponentially smaller amount. And I mean, truly is the most powerful example of diminishing returns. It's almost like as a nation goes on, you sort of approach this like federal speed of light. And maybe the natural cap is like 250 years, because it seems like you hit a point where right, that's what all the guys say, that we're always in like, I mean, I know I'm from friends with the guy who did business in the former Soviet Union in the late 80s. And right up until, and then after it fell too. But like the amount of corruption just to get on a train and get off a train and get into your hotel and to get off a highway off ramp, the amount of money you had to pay, you started to go, why are we even doing business? Even if we are making a killing on, say, fresh tuna, the amount of money it takes just to get an executive to go meet with someone in Moscow is so much money that there's almost this like, we're at this point now where it's so bloated. It's like those dogs you see, they're really sad, those pictures when they have all the ticks on them. It's like that's America. It's just covered in these bloated ticks,
Well,
and it's like
that is an ugly metaphor.
it's
Hey, so
disgusting.
but we're tight today. Did you
Yeah,
want
yeah.
to talk about the CDC?
The CDC. Oh, I want to ask about that. I gotta let you go in 7 minutes. The CDC voting, I saw this last night, to permanently shield Pfizer from vaccine injury liability. Is that correct?
So the we don't know how this is going to play out. So let's hold
Yeah.
our
Yeah.
powder dry a little bit.
Yeah, we do.
Um, because it could, this is starting to come to a head.
Okay.
There's a bunch of organizations that participate in the advisory committee on immunization practices, which is the advisory committee to the CDC and Rochelle Walensky. And some of them are starting to say, no, this is too much. And we even have, I like to say, Paul Offit, who takes credit for inventing the rotavirus vaccine. Actually, it was the second generation one, and it was a large team. But that's his claim to fame. And he's been very involved in vaccine advocacy and oversight on behalf of the federal government. And I often say, Paul Offit, up until just last few months, I don't think he'd ever seen a vaccine that he didn't want to jab into a child. Uh, and even Paul Offit now is getting cold feet and said
Oh,
that we've gone too fast, too far. There's also apparently one of the associations, and I was not able to track it down in the time before this call, but I was told that one of the organizations that participates in the ACIP, one of the professional organizations, has also written a statement in which they are absolutely against authorization in children. And you'll recall there are multiple nation states in Europe that have said no more of these genetic vaccines for 17 and below. On the other side, we have Rochelle Walensky, director of CDC, or nominal director, having made a statement about a week ago that she fully endorses that children 5 and up should be receiving the booster, quote unquote, reformulated bivalent product. And so she's kind of prejudiced the meeting already by saying that. Now, you're absolutely right that technically, if the way this food chain works, is that advisory committee on immunization practice. So the FDA approves or authorizes. In this case, it's still emergency use authorized down to age 5. Okay, so they're not actually approved. They're technically still experimental. And there has absolutely been a drive by the pharmaceutical industry, Pfizer and Moderna, to get the products onto the immunization schedule recommendation for the Vaccines for Children program. Because once that is done, that triggers a liability waiver clause that will survive the termination of the state of emergency, medical emergency, which has been declared and was recently renewed by Biden, and which Congress has the right to conclude, to reject the executive branch's declaration of medical emergency in this case, and they have just weaned out on that. But so the Biden administration has continued to extend, and I think just did recently again, and that allows the whole emergency use authorization superstructure to remain in place with all of those authorizations. As soon as that state of emergency is allowed to expire or it's rescinded by Congress, then the clauses under which these vaccines and many of the drugs are authorized in monoclonal antibodies, which is emergency use authorization, EUA requires that declaration of a state of medical emergency. So once that stops, all of those vanish, like pouring water on the Wicked Witch. And so it appears there's clearly a liability interest. Oh, finishing the story. So the way that the ecosystem works is that ACIP, once it recommends that a product be put on the Vaccines for Children schedule, then there is automatic authorization from Congress to purchase that product. Okay, so it is like the only case in the entire federal government where Congress has pre-authorized purchase, and there is a civilian committee of unelected officials that make basically a purchase decision on behalf of the government that is not subject to federal acquisition regulations. And that will trigger an automatic buy and distribution and potential requirement for schools to require this recommended product that is in the childhood vaccine schedule for all children prior to entry into school. And so it's a twofer for the pharma, because they get a automatic purchase in perpetuity direct from Congress without any congressional oversight, and they get a liability waiver. So that appears to be what the push is for. I absolutely don't get it. None of us have ever heard of a case, there is no prior case, where there was no clear demonstration of effectiveness of the vaccine in preventing and preventing hospitalization, major illness, or death in a child cohort prior to authorization for the childhood schedule. And I was just, for this podcast and others later, I was reviewing the FDA statement of, let me just catch the date, October 12th, 2022, in which they lay out what they call the effectiveness of these products in children. And in what they're basically saying is that effectiveness normally means that the product is producing some impact on disease. And what the FDA has done cleverly is to define effectiveness as an immune response. And so what they've shown in a very small cohort of children is that the booster provokes an immune response that is statistically equivalent, using a small cohort of about 1,200 subjects, to the immune response elicited by the first two jabs. Okay, so they define immune response as effectiveness. That's gibberish. It has nothing to do, there's no clear correlation with prevention of disease. And what they're measuring is not a proven correlate of protection. Okay, that's a hard thing to do, and that's essential in the vaccines business, always has been. If you want to substitute some assay, instead of actually testing whether or not children or adults are protected from the disease, then you have to first prove that that assay correlates with protection. That's never been done. So this is a total sleight of hand. That's on the effectiveness, which is different from efficacy, by the way. Efficacy is something measured in clinical trials. And what they're actually measuring here is not, even with that tortured definition, is not effectiveness, field effectiveness. It's children within a trial. So they are basically twisting their own language.
Yeah.
The other thing that they're asserting is that in a cohort of 1,200 children, they've assessed safety. And they conclude that there are no major safety events in that cohort of 1,200 children that they've examined. And so therefore it's safe and effective. That's how their language is going. But here's the news. In a cohort of 1,200, that is only powered enough statistically to detect something that occurs at a rate of about 1 to 300 or 1 to 400. It's the rule of 3, 4, 8, 12. So anything that would occur at a frequency of less than or greater than 1 in 400, in other words, myocarditis occurs in 1 in 3,000, for example, of young adults, particularly males. It's 1 in 3,000 approximately. Their safety study would never detect a single case of myocarditis at a total population sample size of 1,200. Does that make sense? They'll only detect the very, very common things that happen at a rate of 1 in 400 or less. And so once again, they're using they are distorting the common language process, well-established principles of vaccinology and clinical research and medical affairs to support a narrative that they want to promote, which is the narrative that it's safe and effective. But when you look under the covers, nothing stands up to scrutiny. Over.
It's it's kind of like using an unsophisticated satellite for spy intelligence or for satellite intelligence. If you get something that doesn't have a resolution of 1 by 1 feet, you can look at all of Manhattan. You'll never see a human. Versus zoom in a little more.
Yeah, it's actually a good metaphor. So despite these obvious contradictions and flaws, they are still determined to proceed, which there's nothing more overt that I could think of to demonstrate that the system has been deeply corrupted.
At this point, I'm in a dark way, I'm almost just happy that it's playing out the way it is, because clearly people doing interviews and talking about it, professionals voicing their opinions, isn't changing anyone's mind. So you almost have to be shown it that it is corrupt to the core. And I know I got to let you run. It's 1:29. I did want to say lastly, it's kind of like the butterfly effect. I applied to 35 medical schools in 2013, and I only wrote a letter of intent to one. It was Boston University, because I wanted to go to med school in Boston, move up from Georgia and be closer to family. And they outright rejected me. So, maybe I wouldn't be doing this podcast if it was for that. So many of life is reaping the fruits of your labor. So shout out Boston University. You should have just let me in. And with that, Dr. Malone, thank you so much. I know I got to let you go. I've kept you 5 minutes. I've kept you 5 minutes longer than I said I would, because I'm a terrible host. So I apologize for that. But The Good Doctor, your book will be out sometime in November, and I will put the link to your Getter and your Gab and all that good stuff in the description. Thank you so much. And thank you to Dr. Glasspool, as always, for being patient with me. God bless you, Dr. Malone. Thank you so much.